And it looks like we're live. So welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben, and today I'm talking to Chris McDowall about his current project in the works, Electric Bastionland, which is a follow-up to his acclaimed, by me and other people, Into the Odd, which is one of my favorite games and was a big influence on me getting into the OSR and starting to write my own stuff like Maze Rats. So thanks for joining us, Chris.
Hi. No, thanks for having me. And it's, very kind words.
Yeah, Into the Odd has been a huge deal for, I know, a lot of people getting into the OSR because it's so easy to pick up, and the GM procedures at the end are so nice and clear that was a huge help in me writing like the GM section for Maze Rats. And of course, it's now the foundational system for Silent Titans, which is all the rage at the moment, though I haven't reviewed it yet. That's going to come up. I'm going to do that soon.
Right. Interesting to see what you think.
Yeah. So do you want to tell us about Electric Bastionland? Because that's what you're working on now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working on Electric Bastionland for feels like years now. I sort of wanted to do something to follow up Into the Odd, but I didn't want to just do Into the Odd second edition. And I didn't really want to do just a straight up sort of supplement of like extra stuff to add on to Into the Odd. So really what Electric Bastionland is sort of it's a slightly different take on the same idea, essentially. So the rules are almost the same. There's a few tweaks here and there, but the main difference is the way you create your character, rather than the sort of the one-page table that I used in Into the Odd, where you got a very small starter package of sort of 3 items. I wanted to keep it simple and evocative, but just kind of blow up that idea essentially. So rather than having one table, there's now 100 failed careers. And on each of those failed careers, there are sort of, you get your standard items that kind of bring across some of the flavor of that career. And you get sort of 2 extra items that are sort of also semi-randomly generated. So it's basically creating a lot more possibilities for your character, but it's still that kind of random roll and take what you get idea.
Right. So is it still set up so that the class or the career that you get is based on the 3 stats that you roll, or you just roll what D100 and see what you get?
Yeah, so it's you can just roll D100 because there are 100 in here. But the idea is that it's still based on your highest ability score and your lowest ability score. So it's slightly different to how it works in Into the Odd. So your highest score matched against your lowest score will give you a number between 1 and 94, I think, because of the way the sort of matrix works. And then those extra 6 sort of bonus careers at the end that are kind of technically impossible to get. They were the ones that I decided to farm out to a couple of guest writers, if you like, to get those to write a couple of extra careers that could slot in there.
Who was working on those?
So we've got Arnold Kemp has done 3 and Patrick Stewart has done 3.
Nice. I love to see what they did.
Well, it's always interesting looking at Patrick's writing because he's sort of he likes to sort of, he's very much a wordsmith, as you probably know. So sort of he works with big words, big sentences, big ideas. It's kind of the opposite of what I try and do. So trying to fit his words into the same format that I was using was very interesting. It felt like we were trying to sort of 2 very different sized people trying to share the same clothes, if you get what I mean. But I managed to fit all of his words onto one page just about in the end.
Yeah, and you see that a similar sort of thing in Silent Titans, right? Because Patrick Stewart is famous for his purple prose, which is what I love about it. But yeah, trying to jam it into something really concise with like bullet points was really interesting. I've flipped through Silent Titans, but that was really an unusual change versus the way that Patrick normally writes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of the careers, I should have asked you this before we started, but I'm just going to spring this on you right now. Sure. Did you want to go through the process of rolling a character?
Yeah, let's do it. That sounds great.
Yeah. So do you have some D6s there?
I'm sure that I do. Not on my table with me right now, but I can get a random generator online.
I would say if I can trust you to randomly generate sort of 3D6 down the line. So
I got it.
I can screen share here, so you can see the kind of matrix you've got here.
Okay.
Of your lowest ability score versus your highest ability score. So it's 3D6 down the line for your strength, dexterity, and charisma.
All right. So let's see. So for strength, we got 5, 2, and 5. So 12 for strength.
Okay.
Let me just type that up here. I got 12 for strength. And then for dexterity, I got, let's see, 13. And for will, I'm going to get...
Charisma, come on, you're still stuck in the into the odd.
I'm still stuck in into the odd. Yeah, it's charisma now. 11. So I'm above average and everything. That's good.
Yeah, so you're above average in everything, but in the nicest way, you're kind of boring because you've got kind of quite an even spread. So what I've tried to do is, in the same way as in Into the Odd, what I tried to do is give the weaker characters better starting equipment and the stronger characters sort of disadvantages on their character. I've sort of expanded that now so that if you get kind of middling ability scores, you will hopefully be a bit more interesting, is the idea. So your highest ability score is 13, is that right?
Yep.
And your lowest ability score is
11.
So that means you have career number 43 is your failed career.
Okay.
So I will flick onwards to that. There are lots of gaps for art. Did I say 43?
43.
Let's see. So one up from a... so you're an academic debater.
Ooh, it sounds great.
So there's one of these for each of the careers. You get sort of some sample names. And then over on the right-hand page, you get the equipment that you get sort of for free.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are 2 extra tables. So you're going to roll a d6 for how many pounds you start with, because you do start with d6 pounds in your pocket. So if you give me a quick d6 roll.
Oh, sure. Let's see. 4.
So the first question is, what can you debate forever? And the answer is food history.
Great.
So that would
and
go
that's also how much money I start with, right? Okay.
Yeah, so you start with £4, and then you also get d6 HP as well. Okay. And that's also going to answer the question, what did your university provide as a leaving gift?
I got 6 HP.
So you have a glass bust of your own head. So you have that. You also have a cane and a pocket watch. So yeah, that's your character. So the end result is kind of similar to Into the Odd, where you're only going to start with a couple of items, mm-hmm. And a sort of a vague idea of your sort of character. But it's just, I wanted to have a bit more flavor in there, so it's a little bit more specific.
Yeah, and that's so fast, which is like the big appeal of the Into the Odd system.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still quick, and the additional sort of another thing that's additional, if you can see in the bottom left of the spread, all of the characters will start £10,000 in debt. That's kind of the initial driver of the game, is you're £10,000 in debt, so you decided to become treasure hunters. And if you're the youngest player, this page also tells you who you owe that debt to. So in this case, you owe it to conglomerated taxes. So you are exempt from certain taxes, gaining an effective 50% discount on pets, hair products, and offal. That's
great. So if you don't pay off the debt, someone's coming for you, I assume?
Yeah, so the idea is that the debt holder will come for you. So if you just decide to mess around and not pay off the debt, it's up to the GM to work out what would this conglomerated tax office, how would they sort of chase the debt up, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that gives you a concrete reason to get money, because you don't really get XP for gold Into the Odd, right?
No, so one of the other new additions, I'll stay on screen share for a minute if that's all right. I'm happy to, just because the other sort of big new addition is in terms of one of my big influences was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I always liked from there, as you can tell, the careers is one half of it, but you have a scars table this time as well. So you get some more sort of that kind of, if you get reduced to exactly 0 hit points, you're going to get a permanent scar from this table. And some of those scars will actually give you more HP. So the idea is the more grizzled and scarred you get from being in dangerous situations, the more hit points you're going to get, essentially, and the more survivable you get. And so yeah, that's another bit of sort of addition onto Into the Odds. You've got everything from a smashed mouth, punctured organ, shattered ego. They're kind of broad enough to not be overly specific, but also, again, it's just trying to add a little bit more of that sort of flavor on top of Into the Odd.
Yeah, so as your characters get older, they get more characterful in terms of the things that the world has done to them.
Yeah, the phrase that I like is sort of character growth rather than character advancement. Mm. So you might end up being having certain disadvantages from having all these injuries, but you're going to have more HP, so you're kind of more survivable. And obviously, the other big factor is money. And once you've paid off that debt, you can start to sort of, amass resources, and you're collecting oddities and so on. So I do like that kind of organic character growth rather than, working your way up an XP sort of ladder, if you like.
Interesting. So you don't just get more HP from going on missions the way it was like in Into the Odd?
No, so that has changed now. Yeah. So the only way to get extra HP is through getting scars, essentially. Certain types of scars will cause you to gain HP. And the HP cap's a little bit lower than Into the Odd as well, just to really make things more dangerous.
Yeah. It's really interesting how many you've done. Like you've gone with the D100 different careers, because I've been noticing that's becoming more and more common with games like Warhammer Fantasy. The new one did that. Like Zweihander does that. Troika did it, where you just have like a huge number of these like light little classes to give you like a good starting point. That seems to be like a trend now.
Well, I think part of it comes from just the way that I play games is, as you can probably realize by the lack of advancement rules, is I don't tend to play in big, long campaigns myself. I think the longest campaign I've ever really sort of played is a dozen sessions or so. And I think having lots of different starting points is more interesting to me than having a character class that could advance for a campaign that's going to last a year, because that's just not how I engage with the game. So I understand that some people will want that, but it's sort of not my forte. So I don't want to be the one to write that sort of game, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's been similar to my experience, because I mostly run games with 10-year-olds at a D&D club, and so I've tried Into the Odd with them, and that worked really well. But just in general, the campaigns are 4 or 5 sessions, because you're usually just exploring a dungeon. Yeah. And the kids die fairly frequently, so they need something new and interesting to get them excited and engaged and getting back into the game, rather than just rolling up a normal fighter again. They're not as attached to them.
And I kind of like to think that when you're re-rolling a new character, it's kind of an exciting moment, because you're sort of pulling the spinning the roulette wheel, I guess, again, to see what starting character you get. And people, it's getting that fine balance between, you want death to be not necessarily rewarded, where you're rewarding reckless play, but you do want so that when it happens, there is still some sort of joy to be found in there.
Mm-hmm. Is this game going to have any campaign or pre-written material going along with it in terms of getting people started?
So the idea is, to use a really horrible, cringeworthy phrase, there's the old, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat today. If you teach a man how to fish, all this thing. So what I wanted to do was, there is going to be some sample material at the back of the book. There's the odd, I've used so many of these stupid puns, I've forgotten which one I've used now. The addendum, I believe. Yeah, the addendum is going to be sort of compiled articles, mostly from my blog, and sort of some sample content on encounters, locations, things like that. So there is going to be some stuff you can just use out of the box. But what I wanted to do was make a setting that could be sort of run through procedure. So for each area of the setting, we've got sort of Bastion, the city that's the only city that matters. It's too big to work and too complicated to fall, and it kind of encompasses everything you want about a city for your setting. Rather than draw out maps and lists of encounters for the city, I've sort of got a list of procedures for how to actually run the city yourself and how to come up with your own material. So it comes from everything from there's sort of a method for drawing up a map of your borough using sort of a tube map style system, to just sort of everything is essentially in bullet points and in procedures rather than prose. So the idea is you can have, if your players decide to run down into the underground without you realizing, you can just flip the page open to the 2-page spread on the underground, and you can kind of run it from there. So lots of random tables, lots of little simple procedures to work through. But yeah, it's designed to be run as a game rather than read as a setting, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, that sounds really great. Because there's so many books that just give you way too much to actually run on the fly. So I'd much prefer stuff that I can easily generate from as I'm going through it. Yeah. And by giving people enough tools, like you said, then you're actually going to encourage them to make this stuff on their own.
Yeah, 100%.
That's a big thing with new players, where they feel like they should be making their own stuff, but they don't get nearly enough guidance on how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've sort of, rather than having random tables of existing characters, I'm using these sort of things I'm calling spark tables. So it's sort of, there with me. It's sort of a 2d20 table. In fact, tell you what, let me pop the screen share back on and we can see again. So it's essentially a 2d20 table. So this is a cocktail example. So this is really probably not the most important one. In fact, we'll go to the parlor games one because this is actually slightly better. So for instance, if you were to roll 2d20 and get 8 and 5, you would get that there's a parlor game called Hot Trick, and it's for you to work out what that would be. If you go into a bar and you're asking for a cocktail, if you roll an 11 and a 4, you get a cocktail that's made from mezcal and cherry wine, and you can kind of work from that. So those are sort of sillier examples, but it goes all the way up to sort of at the very high level. There's just one of these for each area of the world. So for Bastion, here I have a spark table of 2d20 things. So they're very sort of broad. So you might roll something and get broken graveyard, which doesn't necessarily immediately tell you what that location would be like, but just having the name broken graveyard, you can kind of already start to come up with your own ideas for how that could work or how that could be an interesting place. So yeah, I use that for everything from locations. There's similar tables for characters and for sort of monsters and so on.
Yeah, that's really great. My experience has been that it's almost always like the sillier tables that players get more obsessed with. Because like they'll go into a bar, they're like, I order a drink, and then they suddenly realize that there's a random table for drinks, and then they'll just spend like half an hour just ordering drinks. They just want to see what they could possibly get. Yeah,
absolutely.
So they're always so excited when they see that whoever made the game is actually taking that into account. I see similar things like when I'm running Maze Rats, have like the randomly generated spells, and so everyone wants to be a wizard because it's just like, I want to see what spells I can get. So
every single time I've played Maze Rats, the group basically just agrees to give everyone a spell.
Yeah.
Because one person will roll a spell and everyone all of a sudden it's like, whoa, hang on, can we just, should we all have this? And same with Knave as well, the sort of the level of spells in there.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop with the praise now because this is unbearable.
It's the Mutual Appreciation Society. Yeah, so I'm going to do something similar like in Maze Nights because I want to have like some wizard-like classes. I'm gonna do something similar to Troika and to what you're doing, where I have a bunch of classes with like a little bit of randomization in there. But I definitely want everyone to be able to use magic because that's what Maze Rats showed me that's what everyone wants to do. So
yeah, and so the way that magic works in Electric Bastionland, it's essentially the same as Into the Ard with a slight bit of rephrasing. So rather than arcana, they're called oddities now.
Okay.
And there's a lot of the classes will start with these oddities, so it's just essentially spells as items, and you're losing a little bit of specialization because sort of everyone can use them. But I think what you gain in the fact that, well, everybody can use them is kind of an advantage, especially for the sort of short form play that I'm used to. I think people just want to play around with silly items and sort of try and find cool tricks to use them for.
Yeah. Does it have an encumbrance system?
Yes. Yeah, just about. So this is about as far as I had a sort of list of mantras at the start of the book when I was sort of writing it out. And one of them was sort of keep the main thing. So keep it as a game about going out looking for treasure and going into dungeons and exploring around. Don't get too bogged down in sort of rules for running a business or, extra things like that. So the other thing that I had was just, I'll tone down the language, but it was stop adding stuff. But stuff was something else. And essentially the idea, I get, so it's very easy to start thinking like, well, yeah, we need an encumbrance system to force some interesting decisions. And then you start adding that in. And then before you know it, you've sort of lost what made the original system a bit different. So at the moment, it's as simple as saying that anything that you need to carry in 2 hands counts as a bulky item.
Okay.
And you can carry 2 bulky items, you're fine. If you carry more than 2 bulky items, you essentially count as having 0 HP. So you're just vulnerable while you're overloaded. And you'll need to rest if you decide to sort of offload them. So it sort of works with the systems that are already in place. It just adds in one more little fiddly rule. And I almost took it out because I think the other thing that I sort of tried to do with this game is like assume common sense.
Mhm.
And I think for most encumbrance systems, you can kind of common sense it to a certain degree. But yeah, I did decide to add it in just to force a few more interesting decisions when it comes to hauling treasure back from locations. Really, that's the main goal there.
Yeah, that seems like that would work really well. It'd be easy to remember anyway, which is the big deal.
Yeah, I mean, because at the sort of base of it, if you imagine you're carrying sort of a long pole in your hands, and you've got another large item on your back, that's what you can manage. If you then say, well, can you also carry this broom? You say, well, no, not really. So it kind of makes logical sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that it seems like encumbrance systems are making a comeback, because for a long time no one used them at all. Like,
we all know who's to blame for this, Ben. I mean,
no. I mean, it wasn't me. I got it from other people who did it was Lamentations. Lamentations actually has an encumbrance system that you would actually use. But yeah, because no one used it. 5e has a system, but it's like in pounds, which everyone ignores.
Yeah.
But Pathfinder 2 now has a slot-based system. It's straight out of like OSR type encumbrance systems. So now people are actually going to use it and pay attention to it, because it's not hard to make a system that everyone will actually use. And it does. I think it just makes the game more interesting, because people will actually, they don't necessarily make a lot of hard decisions, but they're thinking about it in terms of what I want my character to actually have.
I think it's one of those things where it's interesting as long as you do it, then it's never as complicated as it sounds, because it's one of those rules where when you read it as a GM, my instinct is straight away to just think, I've got enough on my plate, I won't bother tracking that, because it feels like it's taking away more than it's adding. Yeah. But I think a good example is something like the encumbrance system in Veins of the Earth. It's a core part of the game. So I think if I was running Veins of the Earth, I wouldn't dream of not having the encumbrance system, because so much of that setting is based on encumbrance and light and rations and surviving in the Underdark. Whereas if you've been watching Critical Role and you come and play 5th edition, and you wanting to play this sort of heroic character-driven game, you're not going to be expecting to be also tracking how much you're carrying.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, I understand why it falls off on 5th edition, but for certain types of game, it makes perfect sense.
Well, almost all OSR games are at their core like resource management on one level or another. So you have to have that in there somehow, or it doesn't matter. Yeah. So lost my train of thought. So what else is new about Electric Bastionland?
That's I mean, the other main thing is obviously this is a prototype. This isn't anywhere near a finished book.
Okay.
But it's obviously, compared to Into the Odd, it's a much bigger, thicker book. So it's going to be around 300 pages and sort of letter size hardback. So it's not going to be replacing Into the Odd, because if you want to spend £15 on a nice, small, neat little book, Into the Odd is still going to be there. But this is sort of for people that want a bit more, or people that want it a bit more expansive. I should say the artwork I'm really excited about. It's going to be done by Luca. I meant to message Luca before and learn how to pronounce his surname, because I'm going to do it wrong whichever way. Luca
Rayetz.
Right. Yeah. I'm glad you knew. So to give you an idea of the sort of style we're working with, we're going for a kind of quite unusual style for sort of a role-playing game. And we're working on a cover at the moment. The pitch was Where's Wally meets L.S. Lowry, in a sort of more kind of early 20th century industrial sort of style.
I know what the first one, in America that's Where's Waldo, but what's the second one?
Yeah, sorry, Where's Waldo? L.S. Lowry is he's a Manchester-based painter who painted a lot of sort of industrial sort of scenes of sort of crowds of workers going into factories.
Okay.
So it's that kind of capturing a large crowd scene. So I'm very excited to see what Luca comes back with on that. And yeah, it's all going to be on a Kickstarter, which we're aiming for middle of August. We've got a date penciled in. Yeah, I can't give the exact date yet, but middle of August is where we're on track for middle of August. Yeah.
So how much of the book is going to be like the DM advice that you have so much of on your blog? Because that's like one of my favorite things about your blog is because you like breaking things into 3 bullet points.
Yeah.
That's like the Chris McDowell thing.
The structure.
And And it's great because it actually, once you boil it down that small, you can actually remember them and you can apply them more consistently. So
yeah, exactly.
like it's yeah. Go ahead.
So the idea was that I would have I've sort of at the back of the book, like I said, I've got this addendum which has some sort of more essay-like things that are, some of them are based on the blog content, some of them are new. So those are your more sort of, here's a page of GM advice written as a kind of a little mini essay. But for everything in the kind of book itself, I wanted everything to be ideally like a procedure. So rather than me ranting for a page about why it's important to give a lot of information to the players so they can make an informed choice, I've just broken it down into a very clear procedure of, you know, give them the information. Here's 3 bullet points on how to give them clear information. Give them a choice. Here's 3 bullet points on how to make a choice interesting. So everything in the GM section is, I think everything is either in the form of a 3 bullet point list or a table.
Okay.
Possibly with a couple of exceptions, but everything is in that kind of very distilled format. So that the idea being, like I say, you can just have it open on the table and it kind of works as a bit of a GM screen. So you can just be remembering. So I'll give you an example of a layout actually. Let me flip to the screen again. So like I said, it's kind of broken down into the 3 areas of the setting. So for those unfamiliar, we've got Bastion, like I say, which is a large city, the only city that matters. It's just moving into the electric age in this setting. So it's kind of a time skip from Into the Odd as well, which is more kind of industrial revolution. This is more sort of early 20th century. And as you can see here, this is everything you need to read in theory to understand Bastion. So if you're going to run a game in Bastion and you don't know anything about it, you should be able to read this page and have an idea in your head of sort of the flavor of what's going on in Bastion. So it's not a case of saying 300 years ago, the city of Bastion was founded by such and such, and then there was the Great War, and then this. It's very much what's happening now, and how is it relevant to your game? So each of the sections of the world has this. There's one for Bastion. There's one for Deep Country, which is everything outside of Bastion. So sort of the further you move away from Bastion, it's almost like going back in time. And everything is pretty bad out in Deep Country. Everything is worse than it was, is one of the principles. And then you also have underneath the entire world, actually, but mostly underneath Bastion, you have the underground, which is sort of a network of tunnels, some natural, some unnatural, and it kind of operates outside of time and space. But yeah, so for each of these sections of the world, you've got an understanding page, you've got a mapping page, which is basically a procedure that you go through, and by the time you've reached the end of that procedure, you've got a map of a borough of Bastion. You have stocking Bastion setting page, which gives you an idea for what to actually put in that borough. And then you have your running Bastion page, which gives you a few situations for when the players want to do something. So if I was being really analytical here, I'd say this is almost drawing from some things like Apocalypse World sort of things. I think this has sort of been in other types of games as well, but sort of almost like triggers.
Yeah.
So when the players say they want to find a specialist, which is something that will happen a lot in a city, if they say they want to find an armorer that will make them some custom armor, rather than having a list of armorers in the book, it's sort of a procedure to keep in your head for when they ask for a shop that's sort of a specialist. So the idea is you give the specialist a second unrelated speciality, so they can't just be an armor maker, they have to be an armor maker and pastry chef or something like that. You have to give them a characteristic counter to their job. So if they're an armor maker, you can't just make them a gruff blacksmith because that's boring. And you have to put them in a complicated situation involving another character. So everything in Bastion is sort of tangled up with each other. So the armorer that you find is probably going to be in a difficult relationship with some other NPC that you know. So yeah, that's your sort of running Bastion page. And then you've got a section sort of touchstones. So these are, if you have an NPC that you want to have an opinion about something, you can roll a D8 and a D4, and it gives you a kind of topic, a hot topic for Bastion at the moment. So if you rolled a 3 and a 2, it could be the breakdown of council control. And these are sort of, again, the idea being that you would sort of skim over these as you're preparing your game, and it just kind of infuses you with the flavor of how Bastion is, rather than sort of painting in every corner myself.
Right.
It's just trying to sort of get the flavor in through these tables and through sort of procedures, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so players can like absorb generally what Bastion is supposed to be like, but they're not feeling compelled to just follow your vision of it, because no one does in these types of games anyway.
No, and the idea is that the sections of the world are meant to be specific enough that they have some flavor. So Bastion isn't just a generic city. I like to think it's got a bit of character of its own, but it's broad enough that if you're in a city somewhere and something weird happens to you, you can probably fit that into Bastion.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're reading a book about Victorian Paris or something, and there's something you like in that book, you can probably fit it in. And same with the sort of the deep country. You can fit anything kind of rural or wilderness in there, and the underground was kind of specifically designed to exist outside of time and space, so that if you've got a dungeon that you want to throw into the underground, you don't need to really worry about how it's there. You can sort of make it be a bit of an anomaly in time and space.
Sure.
So yeah, the sort of the running the game section is sort of tied into the setting here, and then. Yeah, so then the other part of the world story is the other part of the GM guidance is actually on how to create characters. So you've got the different types of being that you're going to encounter. So you've got people, you've got mockeries, who are essentially Muppets. So you can this is purely self-indulgent, because I was always fascinated by the sort of in the Muppet Christmas Carol film, how you got like a Victorian city with like Muppets existing alongside people, and something about that somehow just sparked my imagination. I was always fascinated with, well, wait, are they actually a different class of person? Or I was probably overthinking this film quite heavily, but so this is kind of drawn on from there. So you can have a mockery, you can have machines that exist in the underground, you can have aliens that have come from the living stars, and you can have abominations, which are more your sort of when you need a proper monster to put in there.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the idea here is I haven't given you sort of a big list of monsters. I sort of have templates for 3 sort of generally small, medium, large monsters, and then spark tales to kind of make you come up with your own kind of idea for a monster, rather than me describing it for you whole cloth.
That's brilliant. I love the idea of Muppets in Bastion. I forgot that was even in there. Having just written a whole RPG with Muppets.
I was going to say you're the official Henson RPG designer.
Oh gosh. Yeah, more Muppets. That's fantastic. I'm just going to do play Muppet Christmas Carol, just using Into the Odd now. So
to give you an idea, if you want to, if you don't have 2d20, if you can imagine rolling 2d20, and tell me what result you would get.
7 and 4.
So for your spark table for your mockery, you would have your type is goat, and your talent is eating, which kind of makes sense, because the idea is they all have a talent. In fact, let's go over. So the key principles, every mockery has a talent. So it's innate talent for a particular task, but the talent is often trivial and rarely put to serious use. So they've got kind of, you might find a very gifted being that's a mockery, but they're never going to use it seriously. So they can be quite fun to have to deal with in your game.
Can you actually be a Muppet?
There is a character, a failed career for mockery. So let me find that for you now. Oh, I did have it. Here we go. So if you were to get career number 32, you could be a mockery. So yeah, you get a hidden knife, 3 mock bombs, which are small bombs, and then you get something that you have a theatrical flair for. And more importantly, what type of mockery are you? You could be a mock fox, a mock terrier, mock lizard, mock rhinoceros, mock frog, and mock hog. So
you can be Kermit or Miss Piggy. Those are in there. Well,
with mock frog, you get a crutch and a cap.
So you're Tiny Tim.
Effectively, I think so. But with 5 HP, which is quite robust.
Yeah, that's true. That's great.
So yeah, that's the failed careers career is used very loosely. most of them are careers, but some of them are sort of more what you are. So I recently ran a game at my sort of local club, and one of the sort of rarer backgrounds you can get is an urchin pack. And if you get a pack of urchins, your HP is actually how many urchins are in this pack. So he ended up with a pack of 6 street urchins, and what they ended up what they got for their second role was sort of how are you all connected, and the result that he got was that you were conjoined, which I hadn't planned in there at all. So they had kind of they were all sort of holding hands. They'd been like connected by the hands by some kind of horrible accident. So it was like a chain of 6 children holding hands, which was that was one of the creepier results I've managed to get in there. But you can have something as unusual as that, and then you might just be a chimney sweep. It can go both ways.
Yeah, I love it how the characters are almost like weird items in themselves, where it's like the weird conglomeration of the people you're going to get for your failed careers can give you ways to solve problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the sort of again, when I was trying to think back to keep the main thing for me, the main thing is problem solving is kind of right up there as one of the cores of the game. And so many of the items that are in there are just sort of what would be a weird item that you try and use to solve a problem. So I just had a giant list of items, things like bags of marbles, and a lot of them were in Into the Odd, but I had to sort of expand it, because rather than going from, I think I had 60 starter packs in there, in here you've effectively got sort of 100 times 6 times 6, because you've got all the tables within the tables. Mm-hmm. So the number of items that I needed to come up with ended up being pretty big. So I just had a sort of master list of weird items. So I'd be like out in the supermarket and I'd see something on the shelf and I'd put, I should put pot of glue, I should put that on the list. Or like a pineapple, I'll just give a character a pineapple, I'll put that on the list. So I mean, the end result probably tells you a lot about my grocery shopping habits at the end of the day.
I never thought of doing that, making these giant random tables. Like I should just go to the local like Home Depot or like the home improvement store, just like walk through the aisles, and because all that stuff is great.
I genuinely went onto the sort of the sort of tool shop near me had like a website. So I was genuinely looking through there to sort of find slightly obscure power tools, because again, having the sort of the old electric Bastionland, so we're into sort of people have got things that need batteries basically. So there's lots of sort of weird handheld power tools that are in there now as well, which opens up a few more opportunities.
Yeah. Tell us, you mentioned problem solving, and I think that was definitely one of the biggest focuses of Into the Odd and your blog in general. So can you just tell us about your philosophy of how problem solving fits into RPGs?
Yeah, so I think it's one of these things where I think everybody gets something different out of role-playing games. And for some people, they're into the sort of the whole acting, amateur dramatics type thing. Some people want to be able to plan their character out and get their numbers to go higher and sort of build combinations. But for me, it was always about the idea of you go into a room and there's something a bit weird, and then the GM says, what do you want to do? And it's something that you can't do in any other medium, really, short of like escape rooms. Mm-hmm. But even then, escape rooms frown upon you just crowbarring the door open, as far as I'm aware. So it's sort of like, it's that same kind of thing of it's the tactical infinity. I think that's the phrase that I've heard before, where it obviously applies to combat, but to any situation, if you can come up with a creative solution, those are the things that people tend to remember, I think, when they decided to come up with a creative solution to a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. So even with combat, a lot of the monsters I come up with are sort of either very resistant to damage, or they'll have a really unusual ability that kind of mixes things up so that it's not a straight fight. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a straight fight, that's one thing, and that can be fun. But if a fight is, if you make a fight difficult enough, it just becomes a puzzle effectively. So I try and put that kind of problem solving philosophy into everything from combat to non-combat, into the items that you get. at character creation. It's much more likely to be an unusual item that might help you in some weird edge case than it is to be a sort of a really powerful weapon, for instance.
Yeah, like even the combat system Into the Odd seems to be pushing towards that because everyone just deals damage automatically. So you get through combats way quicker and you more quickly arrive at like the interesting decision points that you make in combat.
Absolutely. I tried to have a sort of I wrote a post about this a while ago about decisive combat. So it's fast, but it's fast, but the decision points are still there. Whereas in my experience, some editions of D&D are they can be slow and there's not really many decision points. It kind of plays itself out. But sometimes it can be fast, but you don't get a decision point between realizing there's danger and responding to the danger. So I've tried to get the pace just right where things are constantly moving so you can see the way that combat is going, but you've still got the opportunity sort of midway through. So it's quite difficult to die in like one hit, for instance, Into the Odd. That very rarely kind of happens. But you will sort of start to get hurt pretty quickly. So you need to make that decision quickly. Because I think when I hear about these games with 2 hour long combats, that can be fun, but it's not what I necessarily want for my own game. I'd rather get through a few different combats, see a few different weird monsters, and get some other situations in there as well.
Yeah. I think people were talking about this recently, maybe on Twitter, about how there is, those three classical gamism, narrativism, and simulationism, but how the OSR doesn't really fit into any of those. A lot of people wanted to call it interactionist, because the focus of the game is dealing with the world around you and changing it and making those decisions.
I feel like it's kind of it's for me. I mean, I know that there's some issues with the sort of this model, but I think I would think of myself as being more focused on the game, which sounds odd because my game has very little in the way of rules, if you like. But I think the game is the problem solving, and the game is the discussion.
Yeah.
So you're still the game is how are we going to survive and how are we going to navigate this environment and explore it safely. So just because you're not looking at numbers and dice all the time doesn't mean you're not playing a game. Because I think trying to simulate reality is a complete folly, frankly, in a role-playing game. And I think the narrative sort of comes out of the game.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of it's a different approach on gamism rather than the kind of playing to get your numbers up. It's more it's more being smart and making smart decisions, I think, which can still be the game.
Yeah, it's like a deceptive thing to call it because when most people talk about gamism, they mean like interacting with mechanics.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Like having the right combination of feats and then using this rule at the right time. Whereas gamism can also mean, just conversations and problem solving out loud. That is also a game, even if there's no mechanics involved and there's no rules for it even involved. You can still be playing.
It's the unique selling point of role-playing games is that the game is still happening when you're not using the rules.
Yeah.
If for those familiar with like board games, if you're thinking about something like Diplomacy, which is a game which are you familiar with Diplomacy?
Yeah.
So it's sort of the rules are pretty light, but a lot of the game in Diplomacy is in the diplomacy of like making deals with people and knowing when to betray someone and so on. But those are rules that aren't really sort of covered in the game. That's rules that happen outside the game. And I think that's still you're still playing a game, and everybody's still very focused on the game. And I think role-playing games could have the same sort of. It's the game that sits on top of the rules, I think.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of people, I've heard this too, have compared Into the Odds procedures and some of the stuff in Maze Rats to Powered by the Apocalypse stuff. Like, did that actually have any influence on your writing, or was that just sort of a coincidence?
I think I'm trying to think whether I've even played. I've read Apocalypse. I remember reading Apocalypse World years ago when it was sort of just blowing up. And sort of, I've sort of looked through some of the other systems, and I would genuinely like to. I played Blades in the Dark recently for the first time, and I gather that's kind of loosely based on Apocalypse World. I think the thing that appealed to me about it is that procedural nature. So things like having the GM moves. So it would be like when I'm probably gonna get these rules completely wrong because I'm not that familiar with the system, but I gather that when you sort of roll a failure. Or when the players roll a failure, the GM has certain moves they can do, and it's things like split them up or force them into a difficult decision, basically. And I think some people see that as kind of like you're restricting what the GM can do. You're saying the GM doesn't have total god power like they should in D&D. But I see it more as the amount of times that you've been in that situation where the players roll a failure and you think, oh, I can't actually think of anything interesting. So you just say, oh, nothing happens. I think it's more of I like those as kind of a fallback for when you need a little bit of inspiration.
It's codified GM advice.
Yeah, exactly. And I would still take it as advice rather than law. I think that's where some people I think have found it difficult to kind of grok it, because I think they look at it and they think, oh, well, I'm the GM, I can do what I want. Don't tell me what I can do. But I'd see it more as like a cheat sheet. It's like, if in doubt, do this. And I think, I have tried to get some of that into Bastionland. I don't know if I would say it's like a direct sort of inspiration, but I do like that sort of model of having like a really clear set of guidelines, so that if someone who hasn't read hundreds of OSR blog posts like we have, like, you want them to be able to read a page and to be able to at least run a good game.
Yeah.
And I think D&D has a real problem with that, because the DMG is how big, and how much of it is actually advice on how to run the game.
Yeah. I think that's going to be a bigger trend going forward, is giving people much more specific, concrete advice on things to do in their game. Because 5th edition basically doesn't have very much at all in terms of what to do on a moment-to-moment basis. Players do this sort of weird thing. What should you do? It's all very vague.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of Bastionland, in fact, I'll do one last screen share, because I've probably shown the entire document by this point. But there is a sort of because I've run the game plenty of times myself, but I still find myself falling into the same old traps of like I said before, like you'll sort of lose track of where you are and what you should be doing, and you sort of reach a bit of a sort of lose momentum a little bit. So what I've tried to do is create a sort of procedure that you can just do if you're running the game. So it's, let me just find it now. It's bear with me. Here we go. So running the game, it's essentially a procedure. This whole spread is meant to be, if you're running the game for the first time, this is what you have out open, because it's the order that you would go through when you're running things. So first of all, you give information generously. And like I say, I've got a little guide here for how to give the information. When they declare action, what do you do? And then there's sort of different systems that you can use to resolve the action. So a dilemma is just giving them a difficult choice. You could just make it happen. And these things might sound obvious to someone that's run lots of games, but saying, you don't have to come up with a role for it. You could just give them a choice between two things and make that interesting. Mm-hmm. Or you can just have it happen. It might not be so obvious to someone else. And then things like, have the result actually have impact. So even if it's a failure, make sure there's impact. And answering questions, if they ask you a question, give them some information, because I'm a big believer in, if they ask you a question and it's a smart question, that's a good contribution to the conversation of the game.
Yeah.
So just give them some more information and just tell them and reward them for that, because you want them to be asking good questions. So yeah, this is, I think in many ways you're right that you could look at this and think this is more like something you'd see in a sort of Apocalypse World style game rather than something like basic D&D. So it's definitely drawing from sort of two different worlds. Yeah,
but all the advice is pushing the DM towards giving the players decisions to make.
Yes.
And pushing them towards that. Like your blog post a while back on making traps super obvious was a huge game changer for me. That totally changed how I saw traps. And then I was just in a game recently with Skeeter Green from Frog God Games. And he just had a trap because he had this big dungeon that had a lot of traps in it. And we walked up to it and it was obviously a trap. It was like a giant pit. There was like a bar over it you could walk that was spinning, and you could smell that there were fumes. And then we spent like an hour just trying to figure out how this thing worked and how to disable it. And it was the best part of the game. It was just
exactly.
Like, here's a problem, figure out how to deal with it. I'm not going to tell you anything unless you ask a question about it. It's great.
Traps make perfect sense if you were actually trying to defend a castle or defend a dungeon, but they're just not that fun in gameplay. From what, like the sort of the classic, you step on a plate and you get stabbed by something for damage. It's just, I've never quite managed to make it good. I've managed to make it feel okay, but it's never been a really great, memorable experience that someone fell down a pit trap in that kind of situation. But yeah, like you said, the focus really is on three things. It's giving the players information, giving them a choice, and then making that choice have impact. Because, like I said, that's the unique selling point of role-playing games, is that you can ask for more information. If you're playing a sort of like Mass Effect style game, you can't always ask the question you want to ask. But in a role-playing game, you can always ask that question, or you can always look closer. And you can always make the choice that you want to make rather than choosing from a menu. And you're not bound by the consequences for your actions that have been planned into the game. Anything could happen is that's what people love about role-playing games. So I really do try and hammer those 3 points home with this kind of procedure.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is the layout, because I can tell that you actually thought about the layout and put a lot of work into keeping things on 1- and 2-page spreads.
Yes, 100%. There's nothing, as far as I'm aware, that goes over over a page turn anyway. It's all spreads. And so I've done the first layout work I've done. I sort of taught myself with a lot of pain how to use layout software in this sort of, it's quite a basic layout, but the one thing I knew I wanted to do was everything on spread. No turning of pages. Even when you've got there's a couple of sections where you have a sort of continued section for a piece of the book, but even then it's split in a way that you probably wouldn't need to turn between the two. You'd probably find the page that you wanted for that situation, and that gives you everything you need. So I think that's the number one. Like I'm not a layout guru by any means, but the number one layout advice I would give to anyone doing a role-playing game book is keep it on. Don't make me turn a page between one table. Sorry, like even if it's a D100 table, find a way to make it work, because flipping over, it's no good.
Yeah, it's not terribly difficult to do if you write it with that in mind, but it makes such a big difference because it basically turns your whole book into like a long DM screen, right? You just sort of like flip to the right page, and like you have like a little temporary DM screen just for whatever topic you're dealing with.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. Funnily enough, when I was designing each spread, it was sort of like, could this be a screen for a particular situation? And that's the idea. Yeah,
like little control panels.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, thank you so much for hanging out and chatting with us about your new project. And when is the Kickstarter coming out?
I will have an official date soon, but mid-August is what I can say for now.
Mid-August. Okay. I'll make sure to let everybody know when that comes out too. Brilliant. So I'll put links down in the description to Chris's blog and to where you can get Into the Odd, although you may have seen my review of that already. And thanks everyone for hanging out, and thanks Chris for being here.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.